Welcome to this curtain raiser at Sci-Fi 2021. We have a very special guest who is going to kick it off. We are going to be with Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who has recently been entrusted with the task of building India's digital trajectory. It's been an important year. We have, courtesy the pandemic, all been completely digitalized in our lives. It's been the digitalization of everything. We have also seen politics, economics, and some of our community affairs completely move online. And of course, when you move online, we have to reconsider many of the past assumptions and arrangements. To discuss India's forward-looking economic and digital ambitions, and to discuss the political and social questions around these, we are delighted that Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar is going to be with us. Thank you for joining us at Sci-Fi, sir.
Thank you, Samir, for having me.
Mr. Chandrasekhar, you have about 1,000 days left in the current term of this government. We've seen 2021 being a watershed moment for digital India. Lots of unicorns, lots of activities, lots of investments. What are your priorities for the next 1,000 days to carry this momentum forward?
Look, I think in 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi came into government for the first time, he was very clear straight off the bat that technology must be deeply embedded in government, in our economy, in our communities, in the way we work, because he believed then, he believes now, and obviously all of us now believe, along with him, that technology can truly, in the Indian context, transform the lives of citizens. And fast forward from 14 to 2020 and now 2021, we've seen how digitization of our economy, digitization of our governance has truly stepped up to the plate, if you may, during this very tremendous COVID pandemic and this deeply disruptive COVID pandemic. And so, if anything, in the post-COVID world, in the post-COVID reality, we are now even deeper believers in the power of technology to impact the lives of the individual citizens, to improve governance, to make India a competitive economy going forward. And so therefore, over the next 1,000 days, it is basically about accelerating the Prime Minister's vision, broad-basing it. We have now tremendous ambitions that have been given to us by the Prime Minister in terms of the electronics industry. Becoming a significant player as the global value chains around the world in the post-COVID world get diversified and tectonically changed. So we have 6 broad areas that we are very focused on. But in a nutshell, all of those 6 areas, in a simple nutshell, amount to accelerating and deepening further what the Prime Minister said in 2014 about Digital India, which is really to change the lives of Indian citizens and to make our economy a $1 trillion digital economy.
To our viewers who are joining in from outside of India, let me also inform you that Mr. Chandrasekhar has been an entrepreneur. He's been one of the early investors in India's digital story. At the turn of the century, he was one of the most important telecommunication services providers. And he has subsequently also invested in some of the enterprises that today constitute the digital ecosystem. So he is deep. You have a skin in the game, sir. What has changed in those 25 years of your participation?
Just to add to that, I think the audience may also want to know that I'm deeply passionate about technology because I started my career as a professional in the Silicon Valley as a chip design engineer. So I have my roots go back to semiconductor and then to telecom and then to the internet. And look, I think all of those 35 years I've been in technology, I have always maintained, and for me, it was really, really inspiring to have a political leader like Prime Minister Narendra Modi echo what a lot of us thought, which is that technology truly can be a game changer for India's trajectory of growth and empowerment and prosperity for our people. And from 14 to now, we have built on that. What I think today is that it has done something deeply structurally transforming of India in a way that pre-2014, any conversation about the economy would focus on the 4 or 5 large Indian groups. There was I don't want to use the word cartelization, but a monopoly on credit and capital that was put to use in the economy. And now we have this economy that is being driven by the energy and passion and innovation and inspiration of hundreds and thousands of young youth, young entrepreneurs. And that is truly what India's economic landscape has become. And to a large extent, these are technology entrepreneurs, or they are entrepreneurs whose business models are driven by technology. The technology enables them to get market access, reach consumers, deliver products, deliver information. So I think that transformation in the Indian economy has been deeply structural. And going forward, I think, like I said, we want to accelerate the pace of digitization of government and increase the connectivity from the 800 million today to 1.2 billion and make India the most connected country in the world, surely the largest connected democracy in the world. That in itself has this impact, we believe, of increasing digital adoption. And as technology enters into education, health, and all of these other non-business areas, these are truly governance and public services areas, and public services and public goods areas, digital adoption will increase, and therefore we believe that's a catalyst for the electronics manufacturing ecosystem to increase as well, expand as well.
What you have basically suggested is this huge emancipatory effect of digitalization. Its ability to provide new opportunities. This year alone, we've seen close to 24 unicorns emerge out of this new landscape that you are building. You want to regulate it. From Poland to Australia, from the EU to India, even the United States of America. We are all knocking our heads on how do we regulate this new landscape. Of course, it has these economic upsides, but we also know it has some challenges.
So I just want to add to that. The measure of the success of Digital India is not just how many unicorns we create. It is also how effectively we have made the promise of democracy a reality. Famously in the 80s, there was a Prime Minister of India who said only 15 paise of every rupee that goes from Delhi reaches the citizen that is intended for. And today, through the power of technology, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji has turned that whole equation, the whole cynicism about democracy and governance on his head, and the 100 paise reaches the citizen that is intended for. So, in my mind, the measure of the effectiveness and the efficacy of technology as used, as demonstrated in India, is both on the entrepreneurship side, also about the empowerment of the citizen. I just wanted to make that point. On the issue of the internet and why it is important for us that the internet remains open, safe and trusted and accountable, is because the internet is the pipeline, is the connectivity between government and citizens, citizens and government, citizens and citizens and business. And in India, with 1 billion Indians coming online in the next 2-3 years and becoming connected, we have women, we have children, we have rural, we have urban, we have the old elderly. So it is very important that we ensure that the internet remains free of any influences that are either predatory in nature or exploitative in nature of the citizen, and or create monopolies and powers that will then effectively have the same effect of these 2-3 points that we are worried about. So we want the internet to be like, we have absolutely no problem with people making it marketplaces, exploiting it commercially, but our mandate as a government is keep it absolutely open. It should be safe and trusted by the users of the internet, and it should be people on the internet should find that the big tech platforms are accountable to them. Now, so therefore, we are not regulating big tech. I don't like to say that we are regulating. We want to keep the internet for its principal stakeholder, the user, accountable, safe and trusted and open. And so if any company believes that because it is on the internet and it has the power to basically hog a piece of the internet, firewall that piece of internet and then run it like its own, sort of a kingdom, we have a problem with that. We will have a problem with that because we, as a democratically elected government, it is our mandate, it is our brief to ensure that it's an open, democratic cyberspace. And by the way, I worked on the internet in its earliest days when I was in the US, and that was the utopian idea of the internet, that it would be a place where people could connect freely, people could speak freely, people would not have commercial influences guiding them in a particular direction, or forces guiding them to a particular point of view. So all of these elements are not issues that we have any ideological problem with, but we believe it comes in the way of keeping the internet the way it should be, which is open, safe and trusted and accountable.
But Mr. Minister, you will certainly agree that since those days of romantic architecture of the internet that was
Sure.
visualized by many of you, many
Utopia,
decades,
yes.
utopian rather,
Right.
you would agree that some real politic has begun to shape
Sure.
its progress. I mean, let me just pose you a simple question. There are sovereign boundaries, and they are real.
Right.
The internet was designed to be the post-sovereign offering to the world. You know, it does not recognize borders. Now, there is a contradiction here. Now, how does a country like India, which wants to export COVID on the one hand, which is an Indian product and an Indian offering to fight, you know, to offer vaccines to the world, make that compatible with the idea of jurisdictions? And similarly, vice versa, we have transnational companies wanting to operate here,
Sure.
and they operate through different ethic, cultural, and traditional practices.
And I'm completely happy with that description of the internet, that really there are no walls. The internet doesn't stop after the boundary of India stops, or the boundary of China stops, or the boundary of the United States stops. The internet is out there as a cyberspace which is geographyless and boundaryless, and allows people from across regions to communicate. But that is not to say that the expectations of safety, expectations of trust, expectations of accountability, the expectations of openness, the expectations of monopolistic conduct not being acceptable, those go away. So these are not contradictions. I think the cyberspace can remain a boundaryless space, but the assumption that therefore no laws of any country applies to cyberspace is flawed.
Okay.
And that is why I believe that is where countries and many jurisdictions, countries across the world, are now waking up to the challenge of how do you create or enforce the laws of the land that exist before the internet, against crime, against exploitation, against monopolies, are enforced even on the cyberspace. And I think for some years these platforms were under the belief that because I am on the internet, and because the internet has no boundaries and no geographies, therefore no laws apply to me, no jurisdictional laws apply to me. And that is where I think that is a
So a
fundamental
recalibration
mistake.
is important.
No, I think this is a jurisprudence that will evolve. I think if you see over the last 5 years, the positions that big tech platforms had 5 years ago to where we are now, they are beginning to converge to the reality. And the reality is being driven not by political public servants like us sitting in a room, but it is really the growing clamor of the users of the internet and users of the big tech. The communities are demanding more accountability, more transparency, less monopolistic power, and governments everywhere are reacting to it.
Now, I didn't want to ask you this question, but
Sure.
you did mention the borders, the boundaries of China. Now, do you think there should be an element of reciprocity? Now, countries that that want to have a unidirectional or a monochromatic control over the internet, should they be given the same privilege in other geographies as well, the ones they deny to you in their own?
Yeah, no, this is a good question, and I think again the world was asleep for the last 30 years. When the country to the north was building up these capabilities without giving reciprocal access to either technologies or markets. And the Cold War, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, was a nice play that they used. And they have, in a sense, created what they have created. I think in today's post-COVID reality, there is a lot more clarity in the minds of the democratic countries about what should be the future of technology, who should be stewarding that, who should be guardianing that, who should be trustees of the future of technology. Should it be open societies, open countries? Should it be countries that are non-transparent and restrictive in terms of their other people's access to what they have? So this is a debate that has started, and I hope that debate leads to the right conclusions, that which I have held for many, many years before I became a minister, that effectively the kind of proliferation, good intention proliferation from Western technology labs that has aided the rise of non-transparent and
Regimes around the world.
around the world, authoritarian regimes around the world, has really put us at where we are today. And going forward, I think we need to be a lot more careful and a lot more, I don't mean guarded, but a lot more aware about how the future of technology will be sort of stewarded.
So, what in your view should be India's thrust around the subject you raise, which is semiconductors and the fab units that we keep hearing about, but we don't see appearing?
No, look, I think there is a tendency to make the semiconductor.
And sorry, I'll just add one more thing.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask you this is because this could be another area of great national insecurity if ignored for too long.
Sure. No, I think, look, our Prime Minister's vision for this entire space and his strategy has been extremely clear from day one. And there is a continuity for that. And of course, there are some additions and some changes and pivots post-COVID. And his starting point was that we have to be a player in electronics. And I think most of your audience will know that after petroleum, the electronics is the biggest, most exported product in the world. The global trade is about more than $1.5 trillion, nearing 2 trillion. And so India has for many, many decades been absent. We were in the 70s and 80s reasonable players, and then through a series of poor policies, we just lost a lot of our electronics manufacturing capabilities. It is only after 2014 that we have now started building back that capacity. And we are about $78 to $100 billion today in total electronics exports. Electronics in terms of the industry. And that is still a small fraction of the $1.5 trillion. The Prime Minister has clear ambitions to make that a 350 billion piece over the next 5-7 years. Now, to build a sustainable, competitive, globally competitive electronics industry, there is a need to broaden the products that we deal with and deepen the ecosystem. And deepening the ecosystem includes both design, system design, software design, as well as the issues of components and semiconductors. And I think it is in that context that we look at semiconductors. We are not looking at semiconductors only in the context of the geopolitical threats to the semiconductor supply chain that we are all facing today. It's not just a short-term reactive approach to the problems of today. We believe, the government believes that we have a strategy of access to secure semiconductor supply chains. We will have in the short term and in the medium term. However, we are also actively looking at part of our electronics ambition, developing a policy that will create a more investment and activity in semiconductor design, the entire value chain, semiconductor design, packaging and testing, fab and materials. There are multiple pieces of it. I hold the view that in the 100x computing performance growth in the next 3 to 5 years, large part of that computing performance growth will come from the design side of systems. And the fab and the actual process part of it will play maybe 10 to 15x. So we understand that. We have reasonable clarity on that. So the observers and your audience should know that if and when we do announce a semiconductor policy, it is not a chasing a trend kind of a thing.
Correct.
I mean, everybody in the world now seems to be wanting to build a fab. But our strategy to the fab is not because everybody else is doing it, but because it is a significant part of the opportunity that we see in the electronic space. And that is the direction down. In terms of skepticism of whether we will actually deliver on it, I think let there be no skepticism when the Prime Minister and this government says that we are going down a direction. It's all hands on deck, and that direction will be gone through. And the semiconductor fab is in the roadmap for this country. I am not in a position to tell you whether it will be this year, 5 years later, 4 years later. But I think a country that aspires like India does to be a big player in electronics has clearly a semiconductor fab, and more than that, a thriving semiconductor ecosystem in its roadmap of development.
And you believe you will be able to find investors, those who are willing to stay the course and invest the kind of...
I'll tell you, Samir, one of the very gratifying things as Minister of Technology or Minister of State for Technology is the number of people, big global brands that are seeking to meet me, and I'm happy to meet them, who have well-developed plans to invest in India. And they are coming out and talking to us about where should we locate the plants, what kind of support can the government give, what is the lay of the land in terms of our own strategic clarity and plan in terms of the future of electronics in this country, in terms of demand, what are we going to do for more digital adoption in this country, etc., etc. So I think on August 15, the Honorable Prime Minister said, "Yahi samay hai, Bharat ka samay hai," and a lot of people didn't quite maybe understand what it meant, but he believes, and we all do, and my belief comes from just experiencing it firsthand with people, that this is the time, this is an inflection point for India's tech sector. I have said in almost all my meetings to all the entrepreneurs in India, it's a time to reset your ambitions, reimagine the future, and the opportunities out there, we just need to go in that direction.
So maybe at the next Sci-Fi, I will quiz you a little more on the progress we have made in this particular on this particular issue. But let me now turn to something that the world is, in a sense, anticipating from us, and it has been baking for a long time: the Personal Data Protection Bill. In many ways, it is going to define how users, businesses, government, and all stakeholders engage with the digital economy of the future.
Sure.
I have argued in many forums overseas that this is perhaps a revision 2, or perhaps a more nuanced version of the GDP that was the GDPR that was brought in by the European Union. So the world is looking forward to our putting this act together soon. And I know this is in the parliamentary process, and perhaps it's not proper to discuss that in detail. But I think there are a couple of issues that perhaps as a minister we may like to hear from you today. The first, of course, is that many argue and many agree that this was a highly interactive process. I myself have hosted certain conversations on this bill as it was being designed. Many worry that there have been some dramatic changes in the last 1 year in this bill, and would it remain inclusive in terms of its participatory nature if it was not again discussed with the stakeholders who participated in its earlier drafting?
No, so the first off, let me dispel any doubts anybody has about the consultative process. I think I was asked this a few days ago in another forum. And I said consultation and consultative processes are part of the DNA of this government. Nobody in this government believes that they have the repository of wisdom and knowledge. We know we are dealing with a tech space where everything is evolutionary, and the more heads around an idea, the better solution we will get. So the consultation will be on. The problem with the data protection bill, and I was, before I became minister, I was a member of that committee. That bill went to committee from parliament just before the COVID hit. And so part of the delay of that bill has been, not part, a large reason for the delay of that bill has been the fact that the committee had to work during COVID. And so there was patchy attendance of members because it was COVID pandemics in parts of the country, people couldn't travel to Delhi, and so on and so forth. So the bill, I think, has gone through a very high quality set of consultations. From what I understand from media and other hearsay is that the process is going smoothly. And the committee will complete its deliberation fairly soon. and it will be then property of Parliament, hopefully before the next session of Parliament. And so, if that is the case, and the government's objective of a PDP bill has always been very clear that we want a regime here that sends a signal not just to Indian consumers, but also consumers outside who use platforms that are based in India or use platforms that are outside of India whose data is processed in India. That we have a very robust, evolving and data protection network, or data protection framework. So I think I'll leave it at that. We have to see what comes to Parliament, and then how the debate and what amendments are moved in Parliament. Everybody, one of the interesting things about this is when I first, as a member of Parliament in 2010, that's about a decade ago, raised this issue of privacy in Parliament, people's eyes glazed over. And they were like, what is that? And now I think the fact that big or small, north or south, east or west, woman or man, every Indian has a particular point of view on privacy.
That itself is a...
Yeah, that itself is, in my opinion, society waking up to this issue. And so therefore, with that kind of awareness, I think we will...
So the question is, if suppose, and I'm just, you won't tell me, you won't know perhaps at this
I won't
time.
know, yes.
But assuming there are some big changes from the draft that was put out in the public domain or made available to stakeholders, is there a process for us to get involved in this discussion again before it becomes act? Or?
I think, Samir, let's wait for what the committee comes up with and then goes to Parliament. And then we will cross that bridge when we come to it. I don't see any reason for anything dramatically negative.
Okay.
If there is a dramatic change to the bill, I'm hoping that it will be an improvement of where we were. Okay. So I don't see any need for us to be concerned.
The other issue is, and perhaps it's not necessarily just on the bill itself, but in the absence of a bill, absence of an act, lots of ministries and departments have come up with their own formulations. There is an issue of encroachment because of the lack of an act. People are in some sense trespassing and putting together their own small pieces to protect their own specific. That's one element, and your ministry's view on that it would be important for all of us. The second is that in the previous version that was available to all of us of the bill itself, there was a bit of a conflation between personal data, sensitive personal data, as it was referred to, and non-personal data. Now, there are two elements here. If everything is sensitive, then nothing is sensitive. And how do you create that distinction? Because then the treatments around localization and access, etc., differ, between the personal data and sensitive personal data.
Right.
And the second is, as soon as non-personal data becomes or comes under a regime even resembling the personal data, you are encroaching on issues around intellectual property, investments. Businesses have built models around refining anonymized data sets. So how do you ensure that you don't kill the business even as you protect the individual?
No, so I think one of the mantras that the Prime Minister has given to almost every ministry, and it's quite unambiguous and it's simple but unambiguous, is that every ministry must be aligned to both ease of living, which is the consumer, consumers' rights, citizens' rights, and ease of doing business. That these are not binaries. There is a tendency to conflate these two as binaries. That if we make this pro-investment, then the citizens have to suffer, and if we have to secure the citizens, the businesses will suffer. And I don't think, I completely agree with his formulation that these are not binaries. And that we can be pro-investment, pro-business as a ministry, as well as secure the fundamental rights of the citizen. So that is the mandate almost clearly across the board to every minister and every ministry in the government. So I don't see this being different. I think for us, if we are securing the Supreme Court directed fundamental right of privacy of our citizens, that is not going to be at the expense of making it difficult for businesses to operate in India. That would be completely contradictory to our whole intention of creating a data protection regime that will invite further and further investments and allow India to become the data processing backhouse of the world. And that is potentially what India can do.
Correct.
That, along with the post-COVID opportunity of having SaaSes, the entire software as a service industry proliferate and grow like you saw Freshworks, and having hundreds of them grow out of India, means that it is in the interest of the country as a whole to have a data protection regime that does not contradict these two seemingly contradictory issues of the citizens' rights and the ability to invest and grow businesses.
So why, in your assessment, is there a negative reaction or response to the non-personal data discussions?
I think we'll wait for how it comes up before I talk about it. I am not sure what the contention of non-personal data is, because is it anonymized data that becomes non-personal for use by AI and all of the other researches that we need, because data sets are the fuel for artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is the kinetic enabler of the next generation of technology.
Correct.
So if you don't have anonymized non-personal data to build these models for artificial intelligence, then there is no artificial intelligence.
Correct.
And that is an area that India can't just stay out of, because China is way ahead even of the world. So we will see what the legislation says. I think it is understood that anonymized data sets and data are going to have to be made available for researchers and entities that are going to be in the AI space, are going to have to be available to government to further improve its governance and policies. So we will see what the construct is, what the bill comes up with. And I mean, I'm not as concerned and perturbed as you are.
Okay. No, I see. The point here is that every time I ask a question, I ask it from a perspective that at some point, Indian companies are going to be operating.
Yeah, but I will agree with one of the arguments we made, that you don't want another regulator.
Correct.
I think one of the recommendations made in the non-personal data, and I've held this view even before I became a minister, so it's not something that I'm saying for the first time, is that we should not have a proliferation of regulators, a personal data regulator and a non-personal data regulator, and having all of these, because there are some businesses that enjoy this kind of regulatory arbitrage opportunity that is represented by multiple regulators. So in that context, if there is a convergence of regulatory entities or institutions for the entire data economy, I will have no problem with that.
So there is another issue which is prickly to some, but perhaps a reality of our times, and most countries are engaging with it. It's the data localization, the idea of data localization. So one, what is the logic and the design behind some of the localization? And second, if you are going to be making this into an act, a part of the Data Protection Act itself, we will have to think about timelines of transition and what happens in that interval.
Yeah, so on data localization, again, I don't want to say anything now before the bill comes out, because I don't know what it says about data localization. I will only say this, that entrepreneurs and businesses, for them, choice on where they store their data, what data centers they store this data, the choice of technology, pricing, access is almost as important an issue as anything else is. So I just leave it at that. In terms of the other question that you raised about, what is you said impact of data localization. Look, there is clearly a view that the data sets that come out of the data generated by India, and India is now generating about 150 exabytes of data per annum. It is about 20% of all of the world's data. We are the fastest growing data producers in the world. We are per capita the fastest consuming data country in the world. So all of this has to be used to the benefit of our economy. Is the starting point of the postulation of data localization. And I have no problem with that. And I think that is correct. Strategically, these data sets represent opportunities for us to create AI and other machine learning capabilities of the kind that we will get once in a lifetime, once in a generation. So we should look at that. Now, but does that mean, is this a question of localization versus access? Is it hard-coded versus soft coded? These are, I think, questions that we will answer when the bill comes out. But I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that data generated by an Indian consumer using a platform that is available in India must be available to Indian researchers in any anonymized form that is not contravening the privacy is a fundamental right for research and work and entrepreneurship in India. That cannot be.
So I think what you are suggesting is that rather than looking at data farms, it is about the access to the data generated.
I suspect that the localization arguments are being made for that. And somewhere it is being conflated with saying that it should also be physically located in a particular location. So let's see how it comes up with. I mean, I am instinctively a person that likes less and less restrictions on what an entrepreneur does. But I have to realistically also accept the fact that there is a legitimate need for this data to be available to India. And we also have an obligation to look at the future of India's technology capabilities. And AI and machine learning is not an area that we can simply walk away because it is because it is inconvenient for entrepreneurs. That cannot be the reason we just walk away from that opportunity.
Another slightly prickly issue, some years ago I wrote rules for digital societies, and one of my norms for these the digital society was that encryption is the norm. Now, is that something that this government embraces, or are you chipping away on that fundamental?
No, we don't have a problem with encryption, because if privacy is a fundamental right in this country, and any government, our government more so, is committed to protecting at every step the fundamental right of our citizens. And some of our skirmishes with our platforms or the disagreements with the platforms are because the platforms tend to take away those fundamental rights. And so we have absolutely no problem with encryption. However, every country traditionally for years has had lawful rights to intercept for illegalities, for crime, for terrorism and national security purposes. Those rights we intend to keep. Encryption does not mean granting a fundamental right to evading law for terrorists from across the border. That is the conflation that we are opposed to.
Now, the other issue, operating systems. You spoke about semiconductors. You also mentioned design. You also mentioned the software and the codes that design much of our digital devices. You would argue, and in fact, I think you have said this in a previous gathering before you became minister, that India needs to up its game in creating operating systems. Much of our mobiles, whether they're Androids or Apple, they are either using US controlled, US coded, US owned operating system or the Chinese owned operating systems. Therefore, what you see on your handheld devices is what they want you to see.
Correct.
And we have seen this happening in Android phones, where in many ways we have seen the gaming of search engines and the gaming of search results. Is India worried about this?
No, I'm not sure worry is the right way to characterize it. I think we see this as an opportunity that we must pursue. I think one of the things about working in the Prime Minister Narendra Modi government is that you are free to sort of draw the future of what you are working in fairly broad terms. And I think software capability beyond the technological services that we provide, but to go into products and to intellectual property linked work, that is intellectual property that is born and nurtured in India, is an area I'm very focused on. And whether that includes operating systems, whether it is operating systems and languages or whatever, I think it is absolutely essential for India to have our capabilities in that. So for example, when a major router company comes into India and says we want to manufacture, I say I also want you to set up an R&D lab here. Because I don't want to just assemble the pieces of the router. I also want to create capabilities and capacities and have another 50,000 engineers over the years trained in the soft part of the technology. And like I said, and I quote this ad nauseum to everybody who comes and I think it's like going around looking for an audience nowadays, which is this 100x compute model.
Correct.
With that, almost 90% of future computing performance growth is going to come from the soft side.
Correct.
Design, electronic systems design,
Correct.
and the software side. And one of the reasons that China became in the last 25 years a big electronics manufacturer is that it built the electronic systems design capabilities in China. And it is clearly on our radar today. And we have a conference coming up later in October where we are encouraging semiconductor design companies and electronic system design companies to become real champions. They're doing a lot of work for outside companies outside India. We want them to do more and more work here, and we are actually prepared to create incentives and policy action to support them. So we want to create software and design champions in India, which create intellectual property in India. And those include operating systems and products.
The final question to
Yes.
you, Mr. Minister, and thank you so much for discussing such a wide array of subjects, is around the ministry itself. We saw a news item yesterday which spoke about lateral entry of directors and joint secretaries and under secretaries into the government. Our Prime Minister has been very keen to pick up talent from outside and bring them into the governance architecture. Do you think it is time to destroy the digital bureaucracies of today and rebuild a whole new governance framework if we are to truly become a digital nation? Because digital is everything, from politics to economics to social to communities to peace and harmony. Are we well managed, well governed as a digital nation today?
No, look, I think anybody would say that we can do better, we must do better. I mean, that is just the DNA for most of us is like that. We are where we are, but we can do better. That's good. That's a good thing, good feeling to have. But I don't believe in dismantling things and destroying things because it's just the fastest way to do it or the most convenient way to do it. I think there are challenges, because the challenges that governments face and ministries face and bureaucrats face today is the proliferation of technology and the embedding of technology in almost everything, and driven by young entrepreneurs who don't have necessarily a respect for the system that old-fashioned entrepreneurs had. And these are young people, 35-year-old people who have a healthy contempt for what they call the system. And we have to still work with them. We can't, and it is about working with them, enabling them. And for working with them and enabling them, we must get their respect. We must get their attention. And I always tell my team, this is not so much about anybody trying to pretend that I am a greater genius than you, and and in technology, there's really, you are about as smart as the last great idea.
Correct.
So I think I'm trying to create a culture of making sure people learn more, we discuss more, brainstorm more. I've instituted a mechanism called the workshop mechanism, where it's not just about the minister saying, this is my idea, but it is about saying, look, let me contribute my ideas to the pot, you contribute your ideas to the pot, let's churn it, let's brainstorm it, let's kick the tires on it and see what comes out of it, which we are impressed, we are happy with. And then we can take it out to the people who are stakeholders. I think that is a better process. And that will mean a healthy mix of people coming in from industry, from academia and bureaucracy, working together. And that is the model for India. And because we have tremendous amount of talent in the private sector, we have tremendous amount of untapped knowledge in the academia, and we have, and I say this with is not facetious at all, we have tremendous amount of experience about society, community, social reach in the bureaucracy and in the government. The key is to put all of that together. Because look, in the private sector, I've been 15 years in politics. I can safely tell you that in 15 years, I have learned many, many things that I did not learn in the private sector, about this country, about its people, about the needs, about the issues. So you would be unnecessarily arrogant to say, I am the private sector and therefore I can replace the bureaucracy. I'll be very arrogant if I am the bureaucrat and say, I don't need the private sector. There is a healthy mix of this that has to be brought together, and I think political leaders are, in a sense, catalysts to making that mix happen.
So in many ways, Mr. Minister, you are suggesting that India has to evolve and develop its own multi-stakeholder model.
Absolutely.
Where it's able to tap into the plethora of talent that resides in various different domains.
Absolutely.
And bring them together for the purpose of the digital nation we are seeking to build. In your conversation today, we have discussed a number of aspects that will contribute to India's journey to $5 trillion. And certainly at $10 trillion, we might as well be the first economy of the world, a $10 trillion economy of the world, fueled on technology, on youth, and on the innovations that we are likely to witness in the coming years. Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining
sir.
us at Sci-Fi. And next year, we will pick up from where we left. this
You can
time.
report card me next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Minister.